Hello and welcome to Power Reflections, a proud member of the Doof Network where we reflect on Wildbow's most popular work as it releases. I'm Ruben Morehouse.
And I'm Elliot Diebold.
And because this is a reflecting episode, it means we have a special guest with us. Welcome, Snowdrop's Tiny Fan, to the show. It's lovely to have you here.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
It's good to have you here. For those of you who don't know Snowdrop's Tiny Fan, you'll have seen her around the community, I'm sure, but the main thing that you might remember her from is this huge document that is almost unimaginably detailed.
And thorough.
And thorough, yes. Going over all the evidence that we know about so far in the Carmine conspiracy. We'll link it in the show notes down below. It's called The Guide to the Carmine Conspiracy. I think you first made it about 3 months ago. Is that right?
Yeah, about then.
I was looking to get a link to it today, and I saw the original Reddit post where you introduced it, and a comment was saying, "Wow, I didn't expect it to be so long. It's 89 pages," and I went and counted, and now it's 147. So it's growing as we find out more information about the Carmine conspiracy. But it's this great in-depth resource. I was reading through it today, and you'll just, possibly intentionally, Walbo has written a complicated enough scenario with enough characters and different motivations that it is impossible to keep them all in your head. So going for a stroll through this document, you really do find something where you're like, oh yeah, wait, that has really interesting ramifications now, or something that you just had kind of half forgotten about.
Well, what's absolutely incredible is that Wildbow is able to keep track of it all and not have any inconsistencies across all of that.
Yeah, I'm always amazed at his ability to juggle the hundreds of balls he throws into the air in these stories. Because, he's not just doing the mystery, he's doing all the character arcs, all these other things. It's so impressive.
Yeah, it really is. So yeah, I'm very excited to have you here. Should we just call you Snowdrop for short, or that feels like it'll get confusing, I suppose?
I think STF works to save us all the hassle.
STF. I'm excited to have you here, though, because I think probably apart from Wabo, you are the person that has the most intricate knowledge of all of the pieces of evidence. So I'm very excited to hear your predictions about who is behind different things.
Oh, but no pressure.
No pressure. Yeah. But they have to be correct, or else,
No,
what was the point of 150 pages of documentation?
I love this document for shutting down all of my tinfoil as well. As soon as I get a crazy idea, I always jump into your doc and I'm like, oh, I think Charles XYZ, and I'll pull up your sort of info on Charles and be like, okay, no, okay, I forgot about that. It's really great for helping me remember stuff like, can we talk about the girls, all the details in that I forget every time I come up with tinfoil.
That conversation is so fun. It's amazing how much you can pull from a 12-line conversation that was in an extra material.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we'll get into some of our theories and stuff later, I suppose. But first, for those of us who do not remember the start of this arc, because it was a long time ago, let's do our classic arc summary. Arc 12, False Moves, starts with 12.1, which is jumping straight into the trial. So the previous arc wrapped up with us as the audience finding out that Marissa was not who she seemed, or ish. I guess it's hard to describe that, but that's pretty much what it was. So we jump into the trial with Phinia, and things are not going well. Basically, Phinia wins all these little argumentative battles to determine a lot of bits about the trial. And it's pretty frustrating, and Verona's not looking so good because she has drunk, poison, effectively.
Yes, and then we jump out of the trio's heads for a bit in the second chapter, 12A, the interlude. And it's finally the interlude we've all been waiting for. Cherry Pop, the real hero of the story, recently cursed, begins her arduous journey of making it across the stream. She fails, but is resuscitated by Tashlit, and then she teams up with her frenemy, Peckersnot, to run interference against Marisica. They're kind of weirdly successful, it turns out. They manage to scare her off, but she does escape, and then the whole town gathers around to watch the trio and try and support them in their trial.
Then we have 12.2, where Avery becomes the wolf and brings Phinia down by being antagonistic and leaning into her goblin side. As she and Liberty bring forth goblins in more ways than one, Lucy argues Phinia down. The Fae surrenders, and the trio negotiates for info on Marcy. Avery leaves early to check on Pam, and she closes an old wound.
What a great moment that was. 12.3, Toadswaller leads the council through the eviction of Marissa and Liz. Gillamay sidetracks the meeting like that one person every office has. Yeah, Gillamay really... I mean, I guess this arc really is demonstrating how much of a fall he has, and we'll get to some more of those conversations later. Eventually, Lucy loses her cool and tries to keep things to the agenda before getting frustrated and just ending things as early as possible to leave with Verona to get their punishments. They're very fair punishments from Jazz.
Possibly too fair punishments from Jazz. And in 12.4, we jump into Verona's head again, and she's hit rock bottom quite literally as she and the crew visit Sig's dream. They do some really cool noir detectiving in his crowd of faces before taking a day to prepare. Next up in the dream visit list is Chloe and Nibble, who have a quick chat about their motivations before Albie kind of whinges everyone out of the situation. Lucy leaves for her date, Verona ponders the mystery of relationships, and then Nicolette warns us that the shit is about to hit the fan.
Then we have 12.5. We see Lucy's date. As she does well, Wallace does amazing, Mia does all right, Amadeus does nothing, and Xavier and Emerson suck at life. Despite the group dynamic and interruptions, Lucy manages to have a good time and connect with Wallace before heading into the dream with Charles, who admits his guilt.
Oh god, 12.5. I mean, this arc had a lot of highlights, so I don't know if I can say it was my favorite, but it was so fucking good. So 12.6, we're in the dream, the dream chapter. We chat to Charles a bit, and he gives his attempts at justifying, which don't quite land. But it's interesting information. He basically lashed out, tried to create the Hungry Choir as a trap for other practitioners, and the Carmine came in and waved her magic wand, and things went bad. Avery decides this isn't good enough and takes Charles to go be tortured by the wolf so she can steal his memories, basically.
Something they still haven't really had to justify to themselves.
Yeah, okay. Did they know that was going to happen? I'm only really thinking about it a bit more now, but I feel like Avery knew that she was going to bump into the wolf because she obviously has been bumping into the wolf in her nightmares whenever she is having nightmares about the path, so that's pretty obvious. And also, it kind of seems obvious that the wolf would want to fuck with Charles. So it's almost, I don't know, pretty cruel.
I don't know. I read that as her being relatively surprised when she saw that the wolf wasn't hers.
Yeah, I think she was kind of winging it a bit. I think she had plans to get extra Snoopy in Charles's shit, but I don't think there was, fairy level scheming. I think it was just kind of she was looking out for an opportunity to dig deeper. And I don't know that she'd really talked to Verona or Lucy about it. She kind of surprised them with it, I think.
Although we have seen a lot more of Avery's predatory side this arc, so who knows?
Yeah, true. After sort of Avery runs off to steal some of Charles's stuff from his real life house, we jump back to Lucy, and her and Verona are basically figuring out that Snowdrop isn't really the best person to hire as an impersonator. And so they lay down some advanced connection blockers and head out to meet Avery, who's out there alone. They all go through Charles's stuff, kind of figure out what happened in this house back in the day, and begin planning for their confrontation with the Musses, basically. They have the opening salvo of that, and it doesn't go well. Mussa is deciding to stay in town.
And then we get our only extra material this arc, Knots and Depressions, where Avery gives us a quick lesson on knotted places, as taught to her by Jude, Zed, and Jessica. It also includes some of her signature doodles.
Love those doodles. In 12.A, which is legally distinct from the earlier interlude 12A, we meet our witch hunters.
It's unfair. It's unfair.
We start in Clint's head and get his backstory with his horrifying fake family that cut out his heart, figuratively and literally, before we kind of jump through perspectives, watching the witch hunters as they go through a series of increasingly more morally complex situations, before we see them get into Kennet and have a bit of a showdown with Mussa, tainted by some brief interactions from Guillaume.
Yes, and then we jump back into Avery's head as her and the rest of Team Kennet plan, in apostrophes, what to do next. Avery insists on going after Raquel to try and talk some sense into her, but she's forgetting that it's Raquel. So it inevitably fails, but Avery does manage to protect her from Cleo, our outsider and extra psychotic witch hunter, who, I mean, actually has a really cool collection of magical artifacts. A less cool collection of fingers too, but the artifacts are cool.
Then in 12.9, we see Verona and the BHI allies chill out in the record store, spying on the witch hunters, for some reason. Things go south, but Verona manages to escape using the power of her magical items and love of goblins.
Avery then in 12.10 is taking notes on different mysteries, trying to figure out why all the new Kennet others are here. She then hangs out with Zed, Jess, and Bree before there's a bit of a town meeting. The Kennet others reveal their dastardly plot to attack Mussa. Oh no! Avery gets a bit upset at this, which is moderately fair, although there's definitely two fair sides to this argument. Before she realizes that Jabba is a big old battery boy.
And in 12.z, we round out the arc by stepping into the mind of the lovely Reed Mussa, who isn't the worst simply because his dad is also here. Outside of his dad, he's got that pretty well locked down. We learn how he ended up where he is. We get to see where it gets him, and then we watch him fall all the way down to Raquel's level, and it's pretty hard to sympathize.
I did stop and wonder after the chapter what it said about me that I enjoyed watching a teenager get his face dragged through broken glass to the extent that I did.
The amount that everyone, including me, celebrates reading that, because it is so cathartic to see Drown get his vengeance, right? I mean, it's just so cathartic. But then again, you're like, oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was trying so hard not to enjoy it. I was really trying. I was like, this is not good. This is not what justice is. But like, oh god, geez, it really feels like he has it coming though.
I feel like in interludes, I'm normally way too sympathetic to the people who the interlude is the perspective from. But God, this one, after that scene where we see Reed taking Drown from that poor homeless girl, all of my sympathy just evaporated.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty rough. What do we think is going to happen with Reed next? I don't know. I don't think I'm raising this question now because I don't think this is something we were planning on talking about later on. Where do we think Reed's going to go? Do we think he's still going to be around in the story? Do we think he is going to play a role?
I think he might have already gone. He gave up everything he had, really. Like, he gave up all of his tools and familiars, and now has also lost his position in the family. I don't know what he can do. Hopefully self-reflect a bit, but...
Yeah, you almost want to think that him losing his place in the family is a good thing for him, that he's going to find out what there is in life that isn't just pleasing his father.
Yeah.
At the very least, it might be a good thing for Raquel to see that. We'll have to hope on that as well, I guess.
Well, so I'm really worried she's going to get a chance now.
Oh, I totally think she is, but hopefully, I mean, I don't have that much faith in her, but seeing what happens to Reed surely must give her at least some pause, right?
I mean, it happened to her mum. If that didn't snap her out of it, I think, yeah, I'm worried for her. This is just going to be something that increases her chances in getting to be in the family, not of the family, which will make her more dangerous because the more set on this goal she is, the more stupid shit she's going to do.
And the really sad part is, from Reed's interlude, we see that she really has no chance of ever becoming in the family rather than of the family. So it's all going to be for naught.
Well, I'm still hung up on, it was in 7.8, Abraham said to someone else, it might have been Bristow, Raquel will never be a member of the family. He straight up said that, and one of the Kenneteers overheard it. And I'm just begging them to like say that to Raquel. Hey, I remember that time I overheard your uncle say you will never be in the family. So either he's getting like gainsaid slash forsworn, or you're not getting in the family.
Yeah, interesting thoughts. Should we jump into some of our general reflections on this arc? STF. What are the things that you found most compelling about this arc? What were you thinking about during this arc?
Yeah, so I told myself I would try to pull out things that weren't just related to the conspiracy. I can do more than one thing. Um, so the first thing I wanted to pull out about this arc that's been sort of jumping out to me a bit is just the dynamic that we've been seeing between the girls recently, and especially developing throughout this arc, although it's kind of been around for the past couple arcs, I think. It feels like there's been a bit of a change in their normal dynamic. Like there's this sense of increased distance almost.
Hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree. I feel for at least the last arc and a half, there's been an uptick in the number of times it's felt like they don't feel like they can communicate with each other for whatever reason, or they're sort of biting their tongue when somebody else says something that really irritates them. Um, it
And
feels like
it's
there's more tension than there has been for most of the story between members of the trio.
It's even been called out explicitly in like a couple places. Like there's a line that I think you called out in one of your live reads that where there are four different birds and there's this line where it's saying like, oh, and they're
Mm.
struggling to fly in formation. And then there's also a moment in 12.9 where Verona just directly says, gosh, I feel like Lucy and I just aren't on the same page anymore very often. And those moments were what made me kind of go back through the arc and look for other places where this was coming out. So from like just a pure distance angle, we have Avery being, the obvious odd one out as Verona and Lucy are grounded. So she's physically distant from them. But then aside from that sort of physical distance, she's also got this sort of emotional distance from the others because, well, mostly she's dealing with knowing that she's going to leave Kenneth after all of this. Like she's planning for that eventuality. And it's great that she's coming to terms with that and processing it. But she hasn't communicated this with Verona and Lucy at all.
Yeah, and it leads to this kind of tragic thing of her. You can feel her starting to intentionally, maybe subconsciously, put that distance there, right? Like distancing herself from things like that, so that she can, leave. Ugh, it's tragic.
Gosh, which is so unhealthy for her in particular. I mean, she's had a lot of
Yeah.
growth moments this arc, and she's been working through things like her toxic ideology around romance. It's been great. But then she's also had all these moments where she's been really concerning. Like, there's this moment where she's in her room alone after they interrogate Charles, and she says that she feels like she's barely hanging on and that the quiet in her house is just crushing her. And you can really feel that distance that she's putting between herself and Lucy and Verona is widening and kind of forcing her to deal with these things alone, which obviously is not something, well, it's something that she's had a lot of trouble with in the past.
Yeah, it almost feels Verona-esque, the way Avery is just trying to push this awkward conversation and these bad feelings down, and just not confront Verona and Lucy with the idea that she's going to leave town. Um, it feels like she's falling into that trap of, oh, because it's only a week, I can deal with it, which is a very understandable trap. I feel like I've definitely fallen into a bunch of times. Like I feel like we all do. Um, but it's that sort of thing that contributes to what we're sort of talking about. Like every time Avery is pushing this stuff down and away, she's kind of letting that distance and the tension creep in, even if it's like a bit subconsciously.
Yeah, and there's the distance between Avery and the others, and then there's also between all three of them, I feel like there's also been a lot more friction than I'm used to. Like the girls haven't really fought that much throughout the book, unless I'm remembering wrong. Like they've normally got along pretty well, all things considered, especially for 13-year-olds. And it's not that they've been openly fighting in this arc, but there's been all of these little moments of like not hostility, but just them sniping at each other in ways that are just a little meaner than I expect between them. Like the Jeremy stuff aside, because that's been discussed a lot already. One of the big moments where I started to pay attention to this was there's that moment after the Phinia trial where they're waiting for Lucy's mom and Verona is like trying to cheer her up a bit and starts talking about their game plan and Lucy shuts it down, which valid. And Verona's just like, oh, sorry, I figured you would want to talk about that. And then she tries again and tries to talk about Lucy's mom instead. And Lucy responds, it'd be cool if my mom was someone you thought of first instead of practice stuff, which, like, whoa, that's such a thing to say.
uh, yeah, it's pretty harsh stuff. I wonder if, like, obviously it makes sense that things are getting more tense between them because obviously we're rapidly approaching the deadline for everything to explode, right? And things are obviously ramping up. I wonder how much when these things are solved or whatever, they will be able to, you know, recover, I guess.
Yeah, well, something that we've brought up, like I feel like since the start of this podcast, you and I, Ruben, like so many times in the story, something's come up, and we've been like, "Oh shit, is this going to be the thing that causes tension within the
Mm.
trio?" And then they almost always just have a frank conversation about it and like work through it. Um, so part of me is very hesitant to suddenly be like, is this a sign that there's going to be like a real problem within the trio because it feels like a trap we've fallen into about 100 times. Um, but it
That's
does
so
feel like
true.
it does feel like that this time. Yeah, I don't know. Part of me thinks uh like particularly on Verona's end, there's definitely a lot of times in Verona's perspective where she almost feels like Avery and Lucy are saying things and kind of judging her. And I wonder how much of that is just born from an insecurity she's carrying, like something that's been going on in Verona's head a lot is not just the fact that she's gainsaid, but even when she's not, she doesn't really have her thing. She doesn't have the specialty and implements, any of that. And she went through all that when she did the alchemy last arc. Um, and I definitely know that in my head, when you're holding on to an insecurity like that, it's very easy to convince yourself that every time somebody is saying something that can it all be construed as like ripping on you for that insecurity? Like you think that they're doing that? Like I wonder how much of this is, Verona maybe just reading the negative side of statements because of her own insecurities.
Now, I don't think we can fully put put that on her though, because we've seen in Lucy's head for one of the sides of there was one of these points where the Jeremy stuff was all kind of raised from Lucy's head, and it was she kind of had to intentionally stop herself from going too far a few times, right?
Yeah.
So I do think Verona is definitely has legs to stand on, and it's not. I think it's more prickly because of their circumstances, but I don't think we can entirely put it down to that.
No, that's fair. But it's probably part of it,
Yeah,
I
it's
think.
interesting that you mentioned things getting lost in translation because I feel like we've been getting that a lot. Like, there's especially that scene with Avery and Verona in the woods where Avery's kind of describing what her ideal self would look like, and Verona laughs at it. And not Verena, Avery gets kind of disproportionately hurt by that because we're inside her head in this chapter, and she's like honestly really torn up that Verona laughed at that. And both of their reactions in that conversation felt just a little disproportionate, like they were assigning worse motives to the other person than the other person necessarily had. And that kind of getting lost in translation contributes to those little moments of friction. But I think you're right. Like, the relationship is probably fine in the ways that count. And we obviously get lots of nice moments between the trio that I haven't called out. But it does seem like, well, I'm getting worried as the stress is getting to them a bit as things heat up.
Yeah, well, I guess like the other side of this is obviously I feel like from the beginning, Pale has sort of been talking a lot about how like cooperation doesn't have to mean that we're all the same. Like the Kennet others, the Kennet trio, a lot of the power of their cooperation came from the fact that they were different and they had different priorities, and basically, like when everyone's getting heard that means this you sort of get all these different perspectives, and that's the real power of their cooperation. But obviously the flip side of everyone being different like that is it can lead to like conflicting opinions and stuff, and like as the stakes get higher and as things get more tense, there is more of a chance that like as that stuff matters more, like the conflict side of things is going to become more prominent. And like it's kind of cool that as we get sort of towards the finale and the end of the story, it's like where dealing with, like, how do you maintain this kind of cooperation as things get harder?
Yeah, no, absolutely. How do we cooperate with each other when stress is making us become our worst selves a little bit and we have to kind of confront the parts of people when they've let their guard down a bit?
Yeah, I do think, like, for example, the friction between Verona and Lucy is probably recoverable, but Avery not telling them that she's leaving for now, what is like a week, right? It's hard to keep track of it because obviously real world time moves different to the in story time, but a fair amount of time at least. Um, that feels like a betrayal to me, a more active betrayal. So yeah, I don't know. We'll have to see. Especially when we know Verona's, like, something that's been hit pretty hard in the past few chapters is Verona's fear of being left behind, and we saw her nightmare uh when she was by herself and her only friend was Melissa, and, like, I don't know.
I think the really sad part is like this is of course going to hurt Verona, it's going to hurt Lucy, because I don't know if you remember the last time that Avery brought up the possibility of her leaving. It was during Edith's trial, and Lucy just kind of freaks out a little bit. She tells
Yeah.
Avery and Verona, like, don't abandon me, don't make me be the one who stays in Kennet. So it's
Mm,
I think it might tear them apart a bit, but it's not like Avery's doing this casually, right? Like, you can see how the guilt is just tearing her up about not having brought this up, and it feels like there's so much going on, and it always feels like the wrong moment to talk about it.
Yeah.
mm.
And with everything going on, like, there's not going to be a good moment for at least, what, 8 days.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I don't know. Yeah, I'm so interested to see where it goes. I like because I think we're probably all convinced that the trio will come out of this, like, intact, but it's going to be interesting to see what we have to go through to get there. Because it does feel like some of these differences or yeah, sources of conflict are going to have to be resolved, and I don't know that they're in the position right now to just easily kind of sit down and talk it out like they have in the past.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um, so, so I don't have a good segue into the next section, so I'm just going to completely change the subject to the next thing in my
let's do
notes.
it.
Which is one of the most exciting things that happened in this arc, in my opinion. We get Charles' confession, which was great and took me like a week to make the doc updates because he said so much. And all of it, like, could have been a lie, so I had to, like, oh God, Wildbow, why would you make me think about whether the things that I'm hearing are actually the truth? I'm not used to that anymore.
It's so weird, isn't it, having to worry about that? We got a bit of that with the showdown with Cleo as well. You just can't follow it.
Terrible. People just lying to your face, that's illegal. That's illegal.
Yeah.
That's a crime for sure.
But we get a lot of information from this confession, and I think it's worth pulling out and trying to just integrate those pieces into our broader understanding of the conspiracy, and also, like, think about what pieces fit with the bigger picture and what don't, and what conclusions can we now draw that now that we have this confession. But first, I feel like it's worth addressing this fact that Charles can lie, and even if he couldn't lie, anyone can lie by omission, right? So the question isn't just, well, how much of Charles's confession was true? The question is, what percentage of the full story did we get from him?
I
So-
like just to pull us back to the guide to the Carmine conspiracy document again. I like what you've done with when there's something that Charles has been the only source of. You've marked it as potential lie and put little truth assessments to measure how likely it is as well, which is just
They're
like,
great.
I guess that's what you have to do in this situation, but it feels like it's so confusing to keep track of.
He's sullying my doc with potentially false
Yeah, I
information.
know.
How dare he?
harmful. Yeah.
Stupid, unreliable
Disrespectful.
witnesses. I like that distinction between not just evaluating how true what he said is, but I guess, like every other character, also thinking how much of the truth did we get? Because, like, one example that's jumping to my mind is this idea, like, Charles clearly tries to lead the Kenneteers into thinking they are potential candidates for the Carmine throne. And we can kind of assume that's bullshit based on can we talk about the girls, which is something you and your doc pointed out to me, which is very handy. But like, yeah, that's the sort of thing where he doesn't just have to lie by omission, but one little misdirect will let him avoid an entire topic. So it's easier for him to lie by omission via giving a little like smaller lie somewhere else.
Yeah, and then it's also worth noting that Charles is absolutely not motivated to tell the whole story, right? Because he seems still on board with the ideology behind the conspiracy and what the conspirators are trying to accomplish. Like his motivation for starting all of this is not gone. Like he makes a show of talking about how he hasn't been in control and that others have been carrying out most of the plan, but he doesn't say that he's been forced to participate or that he regrets helping kill the Carmen. He says the opposite. He says he's accepted these methods, even if he isn't totally okay with what happened. And that makes me think that even if his part of his goal for this confession was to legitimately, confess to the things that he had done wrong, he doesn't want the girls to take down the conspiracy from what I saw.
Yeah, I'm almost certain there's a part where he more or less openly says he still wants the plan to work. Um, so yeah, like it sort of, I feel like a lot of his stuff around, what was the red heron environment and all that. I'm inclined to believe he's sort of telling the truth there. I think he feels bad about that, and he wants to, be held accountable for that. But I, there's also, yeah, this aspect of him where he very much gave the impression he still wants whatever the culprit's plan is to work. And that kind of tells you that anything he's giving us directly related to that has to be suspect.
Yeah, and with that in mind, like we do know that there were things he left out. Like I think you guys discussed this in the reflecting episode where this confession was first made, but there's obviously the books that he still has hidden. There's the conversation that Lucy overheard at the meeting near the beginning of Arc 9, which we now know was Charles and Edith plotting to take the trio out of play. And then there's also the barrier's ability to shut off the practice. We see that used against the Mussers in this arc, but Lucy overhears Charles and Edith talking about that being used on them. And so there's lots of things that he's not bringing up.
Yeah. Oh, this is already breaking my brain.
It's a lot to keep in your head, isn't it?
What's your read on it, STF? You're the expert.
Yeah, tell us the correct answer.
Oh god, I had written a bunch of notes on the little weird parts of his confession, and I wrote out like a whole bunch of paragraphs on his like inconsistent use of singular versus plural pronouns as he's talking about the beginning of the conspiracy. Like there's like moments where he says that Edith is the only person helping him, but then he's still using they to refer to the rest of the conspirators, and it's just super weird and kind of seems like he's hiding something. And then I realized that if I talked about that too much, I would go down a deep, deep rabbit hole and we would be here for like 3 hours. And I decided that, well, it's all throughout the truth assessments in the conspiracy doc. So if you're really interested, you can go read them. But I feel like I shouldn't get into it too much now. But let's talk about something that Charles said here that I do think is legitimately important. And we sort of already brought it up a little bit, but his comments about who is going to don the furs. So he says that thing about the girls possibly being someone who might don the furs, which, as we've kind of already talked about, is probably BS, definitely BS, just based on can we talk about the girls. He also says that the fur outfit is meant to be small. And then the third thing he says is I'm going backwards. The third thing he says is that he doesn't know who's going to don the furs. And he says that Maricica's deciding that. He's just not involved in that decision at all. And Maricica's just going to pick a champion. So those are kind of the 3 points that we get from him.
So,
yeah,
are those all lies, potentially?
Well, let's find out. So the point that he made about one of the Kenneteers donning the furs seems definitely bullshit. One of the culprits definitely thinks they're donning the furs. And in fact, if we believe Charles and it's not Charles that's going to don the furs, this culprit is going to be gainsaid if they don't don the furs, because they say, in Can We Talk About the Girls, I will destroy John, I don the furs, I deal with him, I take the seat. Like, that's very definitive language. There's not wiggle room there. And so if that doesn't happen, this person is, that's borderline an oath, right? Like, it's bad news for this person if that doesn't happen.
Unless, what if that person was Charles? Then Charles can lie to the other conspirator. And then I don't know why he'd do that. I don't know why he would be lying.
It doesn't have to be a lie per se, as like he can just talk in those kinds of absolutes as this is what we're planning on doing, and even if it doesn't end up happening, it's not as big of a deal to Charles as it would be to say Edith.
Yeah. But it would still be it would still imply that he thinks he's donning the furs. What he said to the Kenneteers would still be a lie. I just,
Yes.
I guess I'm just
Yes.
bringing up that it's funny because I think one of the leading theories of who that other person in Can We Talk About the Girls is Charles, um, which means technically he can lie there as well. It seems a lot less likely that he would, but um, whenever Charles is involved now, you do have to like take that step back and think, I don't know, is he doing some weird shit?
Well, but let's think about who it could be, right? Because we have a finite pool of candidates, and when there's a finite pool, you can just process of elimination your way to the person it's going to be. Um, so, like, I think the first thing we can do to start narrowing down the pool is it's probably not going to be a non-conspirator, right? I think there was some discussion about this after. I mean, back when there was discussion about maybe one of the girls taking the seat, there was more discussion about, well, would it even have to be a conspirator? Like maybe the conspirators plan for some non-conspirator to take the seat, and like that plan would still work for them, and that's why they're not worried about not having the furs. But I think that wouldn't make sense just based on what we've seen of the motives of the culprits so far. Like all of those motives seem to hinge on the culprits getting what they want from the new Carmine. Like they need someone who's going to free Edith. They need someone who's going to unforswear Charles. They need someone who's going to protect Maricica. They need someone who's going to be corrupt enough to, as Sig said, strangle the practitioners with red tape. So I think we can safely narrow down our pool to people who are potentially in on the conspiracy. Yeah?
Yeah, or at least like, yeah, no, that makes sense. Like it'd have to be at least one of these people, like Blunt Munch or whoever, who like may not have been super directly involved all the time, but has like worked with them a little bit. Like it'd have to be someone they
Mm-hmm.
trust to do all that corrupt shit when they take the throne.
Right, right. Um, okay, so moving on to Charles's next comment about the outfit being small. Let's say we're living in a world where that is the truth. Charles is legitimately describing what he heard, and the fur outfit is actually going to be small. So who could that be? Well, if we're just considering potential culprits, Gashwad is 3.5 feet tall, so maybe Maricica's angling for him. Um, so just to kind of lay out the arguments for and against Gashwad, one of the arguments against him being involved in the conspiracy is that he only came to Kennet 6 years ago, and the conspiracy was in motion before that, right? It was at least 10 years ago. But Charles says that Maricica is just picking a champion to don the furs, so she could absolutely have brought someone on board later on. And, in fact, I place Maricica as joining the conspiracy like around 2014 at the earliest, based on just in the scene where she inserts herself into the plot. Edith has a body. We know Edith got a body in 2013, so it's got to be after that. Edith also says she didn't make trips to Kennet until she had healed up a bit and had some more independence, so maybe a year out from 2013 is when that would be. So 2014 at the earliest. That lines up almost exactly with when Gashwad came to Kennet. And in the scene where Maricica joins the conspiracy, at the end of it, she says that she'll, quote, talk to some others, which could absolutely be her referring to going off to recruit Gashwad to come to Kennet and later don the furs. So there's an argument to be made here.
Yeah, and it's also not out of the realm of possibility that Maricica like changed it to Gashwad after he showed up or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely.
I like I like Gashwad as a candidate because he is very like fighting focused. That's basically the only thing we knew about him for about 6 or 7 arcs was that uh despite his nature he liked to get in fights. That makes sense as a candidate for the Carmine throne.
Yeah, and then in one of his first scenes, he's described as like wanting to be strong enough to take down his enemies and not being strong enough, so that could absolutely be a motive. And the only problem is could Gashwad have participated in the "Can we talk about the girls" conversation? Well, if we assume the conversation occurred chronologically between 7.8 and 7.9, which is where it occurred in the book, Gashwad is referenced as being at the BHI in both of those chapters. So he wouldn't have been in Kennet to have that conversation at the time. So unless it was had by phone, but like, can
That's
goblins
such a
use
good
phones?
catch. I love that.
I brought up the theory just to tear it down immediately.
It also, I mean, it's been a while since I read Can We Talk About the Girls, but like unless he was de-emphasizing his goblin nature in how he held the conversation, like it didn't read like a goblin. I
Yeah.
feel like goblin speech usually kind of stands out.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So I feel relatively confident saying that this whole like the outfit is going to be small. maybe it'll be one of you. Was maybe Charles just trying to fuck with the girls and drop a bit of a red herring there?
Yeah, I think that's fair enough.
But okay, let's address his last point, which is that he doesn't know who's donning the furs. So we have to, as Elliot brought up earlier, we have to consider the possibility that Charles is planning to don the furs, because he can just, of course, straight up lie to them. And there's just several things that point to him possibly being the fur donner. First of all, he is a fairly good vibe match with the italicized speaker in Can We Talk About the Girls, which is the speaker that's planning to don the furs, mainly in that, as a reminder of what happens in that conversation, the italicized speaker seems very concerned about the girls' well-being. They keep saying, do we have to kill them? Can we avoid hurting them, etc.? And Charles has expressed this sentiment over and over. He, even in their awakening ritual, he's the one who's like, we can't awaken children. What are you doing? And so that, I feel like, is a connection between him and the fur donor, singular. But then besides Can We Talk About the Girls, there's also the fact that Charles says that he had the idea to kill the Carmine, and he talks about how his grand plan is to use the Carmine role to do all sorts of things. But if Marissa joined after Charles and Edith had already had this plan, and he does imply this in the conversation, what was his plan for who would take the seat before that? It seems like this important step for him to just not have thought about it.
That's a very good point.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose he was trying to kind of stay hands off so it wouldn't get twisted, but yeah.
So if Charles is hoping to don the furs, of course he would lie about it here. Why on earth would he tell them that that's his plan? But what would the furs even do to a forsworn person? I don't know. I don't know if he has some safeguard against that. Kind of feels like he'd be consumed, right?
Yeah, it doesn't feel like it would go well for him. I mean, inherently.
Yeah, that is his shtick.
Yeah, why would he insert himself into the most important part of this plan that's already falling apart because he's forsworn? But anyway, so if not Gashwad and not Charles, who else could it be, right? Let's just take out people one by one. I think it's worth bringing up the new Kennet others and whether they could make sense as someone Marissa maybe brought on later to don the furs. I think one of the biggest arguments against it being one of the new others is this one line from Can We Talk About the Girls where the italicized speaker says, I wish we hadn't let them go to that school. And like the use of we there makes it sound like they were part of that decision, right? Like, why would you say we if that was a decision that was made before you even got to Kennet?
Yeah, I mean, also from a narrative perspective, like it if someone's going to be that central to the conspiracy and the plot, it feels like it should be somebody who was there from the outset, instinctively.
Yeah, I'd be a little surprised if such an important piece of the puzzle was brought in so late.
Yeah, exactly.
Definitely some interesting candidates among the new Kennet others, though. Like, Liz could be interesting. Like, if she doppelgangs the other judges, does she just automatically have the right to become Carmine? Or
her powers are still a bit mysterious and kind of crazy, aren't they? Like, it ever since that chase scene / fight scene with her at the end of Arc 11, where we sort of realized she had a lot of extra stuff she could do that we didn't really know that she could do.
Yeah.
She's an even bigger question mark because now we don't quite know what her limits are, but they seem very high. She's quite powerful. It's a little scary.
Yeah, it seems like she was able to reach out basically across the whole town of Kennet to pick traits that she wanted, which is just not something we had seen her do before.
Yeah, and even in her first appearance, she was like copying the Kenneteers' masks. I think in that fight, she was copying like Verona's spell cards.
Yeah.
So like she could use, much like Verona does now that she's gainsaid, she had that ability to do the Charles and the Verona and use magical items that she can kind of copy into existence. Like she's no wonder she killed like 2 squads of witch hunters. She's very scary, powerful, and versatile.
Wait, she was actually practicing, right? I think the girls say that she was using like diagrams, not just items, which is even more terrifying.
Yeah. So what? There seems to be a very short list of things she can't do in the right circumstances, and she's a tough opponent to fight because the stronger you are, the stronger she's going to get to be. Yeah.
I mean, even if she were just a supporting role, like I could see her doppelganging the other judges and then like helping the person donning the furs take the seat using that sort of power as backup.
Yeah.
We really thought we knew the limit of her power, and that has been proven false to us, which means we really don't know what kind of crazy things she could do.
So I do want to step in. Maybe I'm misremembering. Didn't we get a confirmation at one point that she can't doppelgang others? It has to be humans. Maybe I'm misremembering, but just in
Hmm.
terms of her doppelganging the judges, I
Mm.
think that might not be. I think she can only do humans. It's like the fact that she could do practitioners and witch hunters. That's almost the concern.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I would have to go back and read the new other correspondence because I think it would have been brought up there. She
Yeah, that's
hasn't, I think.
yeah, that'd probably be the place to look. Yeah, I can't remember if that was hard confirmed or not, or whether that was an assumption we might have made at one point. Yeah,
Yeah, interesting. Oh, and I guess all of the judges are other. Oh, that's a really good point. Um, but
I mean,
yeah,
still though, like imagine Liz showing up, in a fight between like Cleo and Mussa, like all the shit she's going to get to copy from them. Like she could quickly become like one of the most powerful forces in town.
good thing she ran off, so we obviously won't see her for the rest of the book.
Yep,
Yeah.
we'll never see her again. There is also, I mean, I know this isn't going to happen, but it would be fun, very poetically, to have Liz come in and use her doppelganger ability to somehow find out how the Mussers do their thing and potentially even steal familiars or implements uh, from Abraham. I think that would
Free
be
them.
hilarious. I mean, it's not. Of course, it's not going to happen because why would it? But oh my god, it would be so fun.
I loved that moment in 12.z where Rook just showed up and took Blackhorn.
Oh yeah.
Because I was like, fuck, if anybody's gonna start taking familiars back, it like of course it's fucking Rook.
The line in
Um
there where Reed says, release him, and Rook says, you first. I'm like, holy fuck,
Yes.
Rook, you're
So
so
good.
good.
God, I
well
love
there was an
Rook.
interesting
Yeah.
ethical debate that came into my head the second I read that, which was sort of like we know Rook can change others. Theoretically, can she change Blackhorn so that he was no longer bound by Reed? Like even without all this other stuff? Because I think then it's interesting to ask, should she? Like, presumably even Blackhorn or Drown would have to be like, no, you can't do that to me. And it's like, can Rook force that change on them because she knows that out of the context of the familiar relationship, that is what they'd want? Yeah,
Hmm.
gets messy. I almost want her to be confronted by the ethical dilemma of capturing some of Abraham's familiars and deciding whether or not to enforce change on them to free them from Abraham.
But then that also raises the question of, like, I don't know, if Rook can break familiar bonds, can she do things like fuck with Lucy and her implement? Can she do things like fuck with Avery and Snowdrop's relationship? Like,
I mean, I imagine it's not easy for
mm,
her. And also I think the like familiar implement relationships are a little bit different, a little bit weaker for the muscles because they're uh forcefully borrowed, let's say.
mm,
So that might make it easier. Like maybe because she doesn't have to interrupt the familiar bond, but if she can like disrupt the connection to the seal of the muscles that they use to like steal the bond. I don't know. Sorry. Anyway, this is a massive tangent.
Oh, what were we talking about? Oh, the furs, the furs. I have also seen the theory floating around that Ken could be the one to don the furs, that could be a meaning of paint the town red, as Sig said in his interrogation, or possibly a facet of Ken, although I think it'd be kind of weird for only a part of Kennet to become Carmine. Like, would they be the Carmine downtown Kennet? I don't know. But the biggest issue with that theory, beyond the we statement and can we talk about the girls, is that Verona does talk to KT in Arc 11. I know KT isn't Ken, but KT does confirm no involvement with Edith specifically on the conspiracy front.
mm.
Obviously, that doesn't preclude involvement with Marissa, but I'm like 99% sure the non-italicized speaker in Can We Talk About the Girls is Edith. So having that phone conversation with her would be involvement with Edith in the conspiracy. And like, maybe KT doesn't speak for Ken. You can totally argue that, but I don't love that line of argument. It feels a little too tricksy.
Yeah, I feel like we've had a number of other times in the story where it's sort of been explicitly called out. Like Edith was one where it's like the sort of like pronoun bullshit of like I versus we or whatever isn't really something that actually flies. Like
Yeah.
it, KT saying, "Oh no, it wasn't me because it was Nettie or something." It feels like it would be the same as Edith being like, oh, it wasn't me, it was the girl by candlelight. It might be a little different since they have completely different appearances and like separate bodies, but um, it would catch me by surprise. Yeah.
Yeah. And then in terms of other people, well, I feel like we can just take a bunch of people off the table, like not Edith because she said she wasn't going to don the furs, not Marissa since she said she didn't want to. And in her internal monologue, she talks about wanting protection from the judges, not becoming one. So I don't think so. And then there's not that many candidate others left. Not John, not Alpina. Toadswallow's internal monologue exonerates him. Matthew seems pretty uninvolved at this point. Miss is talked about in third person as an obstacle, and can we talk about the girl? So it's not her. And then the only ones left are Gillermay and Bluntmunch. What do you think about those two?
I reject both on principle.
Yeah.
Not based on evidence, just I don't like it.
I mean, Gillermay is an interesting. I don't think Gillermay is necessarily a willing participant, but I don't know. Maybe there's some shenanigans there that Marissa has planned that would work out in her favor.
Yeah, I mean, he would have to be willing in this situation just because the italicized speaker is like actively and intentionally planning to don the furs. But yeah, I only allow myself to think so many layers deep into Faye shenanigans, so I haven't thought very hard about it. But Bluntmunch, okay, earlier, one of you talked about how the speech patterns in Can We Talk About the Girls doesn't necessarily vibe with goblin speech, but listen to this speech parallel. So from the culprit, we have destroy him. I will. I don the furs. I deal with him. I take the seat. Then that's it. Everything falls into place. Kennett is taken care of. The rest of us are taken care of. And then compare that to this line by Bluntmunch in 2.7. He says, we sniffed trouble, all of us together. We saw the beast. We followed her. Ran into the woman. What's her name? We followed her downtown, not far from here. It's that same sort of choppy, short sentences between both of these speakers, which I'm reading way too much into.
Mm. No, I think it's fair.
Yeah, and Blunt is, in general, less kind of like when we sort of mention that in terms of Gashwad. Gashwad is always very like yelly and crude. That Blunt Munch is less so. And I'm trying to remember, like Blunt Munch's origin story. Isn't he running away from some like evil queen goblin thing?
Yes.
Yeah. So I guess. I think he said the second she realizes he's here, he'd have to leave or something. So maybe this is his ticket out to get outside of her influence. Like that, there's a motivation there that makes sense. I think.
Yeah, and then the only thing that really, I mean, so the girls seem pretty convinced that he's at least a conspirator, although that isn't confirmed yet. We're just sort of going off of like, well, we know some goblins have to be involved. And the only issue is he does confirm explicitly in his interview that he had no part in the Carmine's death or disappearance. So I'm not sure how you would get around that. Maybe he was brought on after that, but who knows?
I mean, I suppose you could argue if he's been completely hands off.
Yeah.
And just like if, people have been coming up to him and saying, hey, you want to be the conspirator, we'll get you the furs, but he hasn't actively done anything. He could get away with that phrasing.
Yeah, no part in the death or disappearance, but, some part in the overall conspiracy.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, absolutely. Well, now that we've worked through every single possible person that it could be, hey, when you have a constrained solution space, you get the privilege of going through all of the options. But might as well continue on the train of analyzing the info we get from Charles' confession. But also, so that I'm not talking about one scene for the entire part of this podcast, let's connect the information we get from Charles to the information we get from Sig's interrogation. So namely, the culprit's plan for Kennett and like what pieces we can put together at this point, because that's like a big open question, right?
Yeah.
So just to summarize the broader goals first, because I think they are important in what the plan for Kennett specifically is. So out of the conspirators so far, Charles does seem to be the visionary. Like Edith and Marissa are sort of in it for selfish motives, but Charles has this big plan where he wants all of the Forsworn in the region to be forgiven and that like the practice might be weakened as a whole. He wants the system to come apart at the seams. And well, he clarifies that he doesn't actually like expect that to happen. And he doesn't have necessarily any faith that humanity would replace the system with something better. But he says that he hopes that, quote, One small change here could provoke thought elsewhere. I'd hope that could change what Solomon built. So he has somewhat broad good goals, I think, or, by some definition of good.
Uh, yeah, he's at least convinced himself that he's not as selfish as the other two. The other two are kind of openly just in it for themselves. Charles
Yeah.
has at least convinced himself he's got grander ideals.
And then from Sig, we get a similar picture, but it fleshes out what exactly the conspirators plan to happen as they try to use the Carmine role to enact their goals. So, part one of the plan seems to be strangling the practitioners with red tape. And when we first get this passage, it's a bit unclear, like who the they that Sig is referring to is, but now it seems pretty clear that he's talking about practitioner society. And this probably just translates to using the Carmine's leeway in interpreting the rules to make practitioners' lives as difficult as possible. Part two is the practitioners changing the policies and regulations, which the girls later decide means that practitioners will pick lords because that will exempt them from the influence of a corrupt Carmine. And then part three is that the practitioners will absolutely tear each other apart as they fight over who gets to be in charge. So besides this being very interesting, why is this important for what's going to happen in Kennet specifically? Because I think it gives us an idea of not just what the culprits want, but also like their capacity for long-term planning. Because Charles may have these broad, noble goals, but the plan Sig lays out is much more short-sighted, I want to call it.
I suppose that's where Marissa comes in to turn a plan that she thought was going to fail into one that will work.
Well, but even if it succeeds, even if it goes exactly as Sig lays it out, it's basically just giving the practice a middle finger for as long as they can, knowing that practitioners will eventually escape the Carmine's influence by becoming lords and probably put everything right back to the way that it was before through that influence, except maybe even worse than it was before, because then the judges will have even less influence over the area, which further undermines the part of the Seal of Solomon where some powerful others are supposed to hold sway over practitioners. It's this vindictive little plan that just feels like it's going to hurt everyone for like a very small amount of immediate gain.
I think I can understand that though. I mean, like for Marissa, I think part of what she wants to do is just kind of sow enough chaos that she can get away from the things that are, hounding her. I think this plan fulfills that. And yes, it's a temporary thing, but it might be it might last enough time that Mariska, can dog her her duties and her pursuits.
Yeah, and if Edith is freed, then that's pretty much all she wants, so she's got it. Just poor Charles left in the dust, as always.
And it's obviously incredibly a selfish plan, but I think we kind of knew that about Mariska from her interlude, right? She made the decisions of really her goals are the same as Miss and the Kennetiers' goals. She just decided to do it her own shitty way.
Yeah.
Why take anyone else with you when you could just escape all by yourself and not change the system at all?
Exactly.
Honestly, it rings true of what Charles says his original plan was, which was just hurting his former friends out of anger over his situation. Yeah, basically. So with that perspective in mind, let's talk about what they're going to do to Kennet, because there's definitely some plan, and can we talk about the girls? The culprits specifically note that once the italicized speaker takes the seat, Kennet is taken care of, which makes you think that they're trying to protect Kennet somehow, or maybe reinforce Kennet's role as maybe a haven for others, possibly. We also get Rook in 11.7, I think, saying that the culprits are going to somehow twist Mrs. Plan for Kennet into something it's not, and they're doing it in this way that's venal and short-sighted. And then finally, we get Sig's comment about painting the town red, which is not ominous at all. What do you think that statement means? Because I know there's a lot of, probably intentionally, there's a lot of ways to read that.
I'm still on my the Carmine herself is involved in the conspiracy angle, so that I think explains it pretty well.
We'll definitely be talking about that when we record our episode on 12.13.1 later tonight.
Yes, indeed.
I like the idea. I remember there was a line from Rook at one point about how she saw what the culprits were doing as like the short-sighted, shitty, won't work version of what Miss is going for. So I think the read that taking care of Kennet is them thinking they're going to help keep supporting what Kennet is now, not realizing that like this is going to draw all that extra attention, um, or not accounting for it, it tracks. Like the idea that they support what Kennedy is trying to be in theory, and they're in their own way trying to help that idea.
Yeah, so maybe their broader goals, I mean, and Rook sort of implies this, their broader goals are similar to Mrs. They want Kennet to be this sanctuary or haven, but the implementation details are very different. Like
Yeah,
especially zeroing in on painting the town red. There's a lot of things that could mean, but one of the biggest possibilities seems to be just the Carmine's blood soaking the town. So the Sable
Yeah.
Prince tells us during Edith's interrogation that Kennet being soaked in Carmine blood / her body being in Kennet prevents the other judges from holding sway over the town. So by painting the town red, the conspirators could be hoping to gain maybe sole control over the town. So whatever they have in store for Kennet, the other judges can't step in and enforce their will.
that makes a lot of sense. Like, because if the goal is to kind of undo or escape the seal, escaping the judges is a super important part of that because they are what governs areas that aren't run by practitioners.
Mm.
So yeah, and that I guess ties into a lot of the knotted stuff. Like it sounds like the only places that ever operate like this anywhere in the world are knotted places.
Yeah, that knotted extra material felt really pointed.
Yeah,
I mean, and that's another way that the Carmine blood painting the town red could help them is as you let it keep pooling, the town gets knotted, and in a knotted place, you're more free to deviate from the rules of the universe, to not respect innocence, to possibly make it easier for others like Nibble and Chloe to eat, for the goblins to go into town. So, I mean, it very much fits into their overall theme of like, screw the system.
yeah. Although obviously there are a bunch of these knotted places around, and it doesn't really sound like they're great to be in. So yeah, it ties into that idea of they're kind of ruining. Like if Miss is trying to do this better, and they're just kind of reducing it to the shitty, not actually that rare way that places like this get set up.
Yeah, that Rook has seen over and over again and has seen it fail.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, Another thing I was thinking for possibly painting the town red is in 12.z, we get this lovely reminder that when Montague takes over the perimeter, he turns the town red. The sky turns red while he's taking over the barrier. He paints the town red. Um, so we know that Charles and Edith were talking about using the barrier against the girls, but maybe it's a bit more general than that. Like, what happens if Montague takes over the perimeter permanently and practice gets shut off and the
Mm.
town gets sealed off? Like, that could absolutely be part of the culprits, reinforcing Kennet as this place where others live completely separate from the rest of society.
It makes a lot of sense. I think there's a
Yeah.
way to, whoever ascends to the Carmine throne, funnel that power into Montague to allow that to happen.
Well, the sad thing about Monty is he doesn't seem to be able to control that much of like how he takes over systems. So like
Yeah.
he doesn't even need to be a willing participant. If they just sort of stick him on the perimeter, he will just kind of take it over in that way, whether he wants to or not, basically.
Hmm.
Uh, which is not ideal for him or for anyone else except the conspirators.
Yeah, I wonder how many new others that goes for, that like they don't even have to know about the conspiracy. They just have to be ready to be used by the conspiracy. Like Ken, I feel like that's where we're going with Ken, honestly. And while we're on the subject of how the conspirators might be trying to shift Kennet, what better way to do that than through Ken? I loved the idea you had the other day about using Jabber as like a power source to help changes made to Ken affect the town directly. I think that could be an avenue for shaping the kind of knot that Kennet becomes, maybe?
Yeah, I just I wonder what shape exactly that will take. It's hard to know exactly, but probably not good.
God, and you just want to lay it side by side with whatever Mrs. plan for Kennet is. Like, I want to see her 5-step plan and then like put it next to the conspirators and just talk about all of the themes that overlap and contrast between them. Um, Although I realize it's a controversial take that Miss is not in on the conspiracy. And to assume that those plans are not one and the same is not necessarily obvious. But honestly, one of the reasons I don't think Miss is a conspirator is that I think her plan for Kennet is going to be important thematically to compare against the conspirators' plan. Like, the conspirators are going for this dramatic, quick change, whereas Miss, I think we would see her do something a lot more subtle. Like Elliot, I think you were talking in one of your live reads about like one of the big themes of Pale being asking the question of what does effective change look like? And so I think it could be really interesting for the conspirators and Miss to present different paths forward that can be contrasted with each other.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. That's sort of the assumption I've been working off of, that Miss and their plans are kind of competing. It's like, yeah, I think you mentioned already. Rook's been talking about it. It's like everyone kind of has the same idea, which is the system is bad and we need to change it. It's just everyone's kind of disagreeing on how exactly they should do that and what the end goal should be. Um, it's actually kind of news to me that so many people think Miss is involved, because I would have assumed that was a tinfoil theory, not a mainstream one.
Oh, I think I just see it a lot. But maybe it's just the discussions that I've been participating in.
No, that's fair. I'm frustratingly out of the loop with most of the community at the moment, so like it absolutely could be. It's just it. God, I'm the sense of betrayal I will feel if Miss is involved in this.
But it's so juicy. I mean, like,
I can't believe it. I
No.
just she can't do that to us. Wildbow can't do
Honestly,
that to us.
if Miss is on the side of the conspirators, I think I would have to reevaluate what side I'm on.
yeah, I mean that's maybe even more compelling argument for it being the case, though, right? Like, we're in a Wildbow story here. Let's not forget that Wildbow isn't just going to have us have simple answers to the problems that the Kenneteers face.
I'm back to rejecting things on principle.
But like the thing that I think makes this really interesting, the Mrs. Involved angle, is the convenience of her kind of dropping out of and coming back into the story when she feels like she should, basically, is worrying. Like, you know, she dropped out. She took a back seat, and yes, it was with a stated noble goal, but then she just kind of came back as well, and she's been able to kind of take a back seat in the Kenneteers' minds because she left for broad periods of time. I don't know. That to me is just kind of, again, a little bit suspicious.
Well, we know that she's this terrifyingly competent strategist.
Yeah.
So I feel like whatever she's doing, it's part of this master plan. I just think that master plan is on the side of the Kenneteers.
Yeah, I think what is interesting, I'm going to maintain the belief that, yeah, she's an alternate plan for the future, and her process has been corrupted by the culprits. What's interesting to consider there is, for somebody who does seem so clued in so many ways, I've long wondered how she got so caught off guard by this. Like, did she find out this was going on when the Carmine Beast died? If so, how did she miss it till then? Especially since it seems like quite a few members of the town were involved. Um,
Let me answer your
it,
question with a question, which is how was she able to pick the girls so quickly the night of the murder? Because it was the night of the murder that she picked them. And her whole plan hinged on them being exceptional at the practice. How was she able to pick them so quickly if she didn't already know that this was going to happen?
yeah, that's a really good point. Maybe I mean, maybe she always had this planned as a contingency because she had the vibe that something was probably going to go wrong. Or yeah, like I could totally believe she just kept her eye on, you know, people in town, just to sort of see, oh, if we need some emergency practitioners, who can I tap?
Well, and I wonder if maybe awakening practitioners was always part of her long term plan. Like, it seems like, I mean, clearly she's been plotting. Plotting makes it sound bad. She's been planning the place that Kennett became for, I mean, decades. More than 10 years ago in Edith's interlude. I can't talk right now. In Edith's interlude, we catch wind of Miss cleaning house, I assume to make sure Kennett had the correct balance of others. And then we see in the Witch Hunter interlude how strange Kennett's perimeter is and like how elaborate it is and how unusual that is. And we see Miss meeting Leanne outside Kennett and saying that she thinks of little else beside the work that she does for Kennett. So clearly she has this very elaborate long-term plan and she wants to set a precedent, right? That's what we see in 5.d. She's trying to use Kennett to
Yeah.
set a precedent. You cannot set a precedent in a knotted place, can you? Because by definition, that's an edge case. That's something the universe has shunted aside because it doesn't fit in with the rest of the system.
Yeah, I don't think it being a knotted place was part of her plans. I think she was going for something a lot more subtle and long term, and the culprits have co-opted it.
Yeah, I feel like that wouldn't vibe with what she's trying to do at all. But and even to take it a step further, Kenneth also, I think, couldn't live in isolation forever. Because I think that same logic applies to a town in isolation, that it's hard to set a precedent when you have shut yourself out from the rest of society. And so eventually, Kenneth has to come back into the spotlight. And when it does come into the spotlight, Kenneth needs practitioners, right? Because the alternative to having your own practitioners is to have outside practitioners decide that this is dangerous and needs to be shut down. So maybe it was always her plan to awaken practitioners, and the Carmine conspiracy just accelerated that.
That makes sense to me. Yeah, if only Miss could fight her nature for 5 minutes and tell us her fucking plan.
God, why is she so sketchy, even at this point in the book? Like, just sit the
Yeah,
girls down and talk to them about what your deal is.
my sister's about halfway through arc 3 at the moment, and like I was chatting to her the other day, and she was just basically saying what I remember feeling at that point in the story, which is like, I think Miss had just disappeared, and she's like, I want to trust Miss,
Yeah.
but she makes it so fucking hard.
I mean, that was Matthew for most of the story, right?
Yeah, yeah. Um, like just yeah, these people who it's like, I kind of get why you're doing it, but God, you need to just tell us what's happening.
Honestly, I think one of the big differences between what her plan for Kenneth is going to be and, to contrast that with the culprit's plan is just this potential for long-term positive change. And maybe that's me just projecting too much goodness onto Mrs. Plan. But the culprits, we sort of talked about this before, they have this short-sighted kind of vindictive plan that sort of wants to change the system, but also doesn't really expect to. Whereas Miss seems to be very much working within the system, trying to build towards something better. Um, it's it's the difference between like running away from the old system and like running towards a new, better system.
Yeah, like I could almost picture Miss's goals involving awakening practitioners like the Kenneteers and putting them on the council and creating a situation where the town had practitioners and checked all the boxes it needs to for like the Seal of Solomon to make everybody else piss off, but also establish it as a place where those practitioners respect the other Kennet citizens as equal members of the town council, like the Kenneteers are doing, um,
Mm.
and just sort of slowly eroding at the toxic parts of the seal through stuff like that, like setting a place where the precedent is we check all the seal's boxes, but the others are treated as equal citizens who have the same rights as the practitioners. And then if that starts to get picked up in other places, then you start to tear away at some other little parts that are less good, and over a couple of 100 years, maybe you achieve something good.
Yeah, practitioners who are held accountable by the community and beholden to the community. And there's more checks and balances between the two groups than there generally is.
Yeah, because the way the Kenneteers are directly tied to the Kennet others for their power is actually a super interesting aspect. It incentivizes them to protect and empower the others, but also gives the others a way to kind of hold them accountable. Like like the Kenneteers directly get their power from, for want of a better word, their constituents. Um,
I think that's an especially interesting point to raise, considering the role the musses seem to be playing as the representation of practitioners against that system, right? Because the musses also get their power from their, in air quotes, constituents. It's just that these
well,
constituents have been stolen / coerced into supporting them.
I I almost want to use the term slaves rather than
Well,
constituents
yeah,
in that.
I think that's fair.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So
yeah,
I
no,
think
great
it's an
point.
interesting thematic, showdown of like, effectively, what the Kenneteers are doing is forming in partnerships with these others rather than coercing them into, taking their power.
It's a good motive to be moral in a world that sort of punishes morality.
Mm, yeah. And the fact that people have been clearly remarking on how powerful the Kenneteers are. Um, like we constantly got lines during the BHI where people were like, "How the hell are these three so strong? How do they have so much power?" It feels almost like the moments early on in Monsters Inc. where somebody Boo laughs and you realize that the power goes up really high, and that comes back later when laughter is 10 times more powerful than screams, right? And this is a
Yeah.
perfect analogy, and I won't hear any dissent against it. But
I mean,
like,
I'm trying, but it's actually a very good one.
so we'll get to the end, and it'll be this moment of instead of the Kenneteers, instead of practitioners, making others subservient, they're teaching comedy classes to the other people on the scare floor, right? Like,
The true power was the friends that we made along the way.
yeah, I mean, unironically, yeah.
I mean, yeah. What's almost interesting though is like every read I have of Mrs. Plan, and I think Rook backs this up at one point, is that it is a very long term one, and so I can see the argument of some of the conspirators, like again, like if there are so many others and people suffering, the idea of change that's going to be slow, subtle, and take hundreds of years to fix it obviously isn't perfect because that like a lot of people are going to suffer in the meantime. Like if the Carmine conspiracy hadn't drawn all this attention to Kennett or whatever, the Musses could potentially be running around for hundreds of years before they get stopped. And
Yeah.
so you kind of like with this slow, subtle way, you're allowing that to happen for longer than somebody who tries to topple it a bit more like the Carmine conspirators are. So there's this really interesting moral debate there about like, do you allow some of these evils to continue with the goal of like stopping them in the future, as opposed to trying to topple the system and creating anarchy that's arguably going to be worse, but hopefully can produce something better quicker.
Yeah, it's the trade off between the people that are hurt in the meantime versus the people that you will actively hurt by throwing the system into chaos.
Yeah, exactly. Bit of a trolley problem in a way.
I do think one of the things that works about this system, though, is it doesn't have to be immediate, right? Like, it's obviously the systems that exist are somewhat self-perpetuating, right? Things like the Musses, powerful families that can then perpetuate the way that they do things. But you know, clearly the Kenneteers have enough power from what they're doing that if they publish their tell-all book or whatever, it will encourage other people to try what they're doing, e.g., try finding others that are nice and becoming their nominated champion, right? As a way to get more power quickly in an also not horrible way. I don't know, like I just think it doesn't need to be, it's an idea that can stand on its own without needing, you know, a system to reinforce it because it just is better, right?
Yeah, I feel like a tricky part of that would be if people were attracted to this plan because of the draw of the power that it offers, it would be tricky about to get people involved who aren't just in it for the power and aren't going to abuse the others that they make this arrangement with.
Yeah, you need to be careful you set this I mean, this is the problem with anything. You need to I mean, you're trying to set up a system that isn't going to be easily corruptible, and I mean, that's kind of an unsolved problem in world politics if you look at
Yeah.
it. Like, you know, communism hasn't worked out great in a lot of places, neither has like democracy and capitalism. Like there's people find a way to fuck it up. Is a pretty consistent theme of geopolitics. So, yeah, like it's tricky because you need to incentivize people to follow the rules, but it's also hard to do that without creating uh, loopholes that can be abused.
Honestly, I feel like what the Kenneteers have going is pretty close to ideal, but a lot of that is just because they're good people at their core, and it seems like a
Exactly.
lot of practitioner society is not.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like a thing in game theory, which is that like benevolent dictators are the best form of government. But the trick is finding a benevolent dictator isn't super easy Like you could get a dictator easily enough, but keeping the benevolent is quite tricky. Um, and that's like the issue with reproducing something like Kennet is uh finding someone as good as the Kenneteers and as good as the non-culprit Kennet others is easier said than done. You only need one rotten apple to start, well, turning Kennet into what it is now.
Yeah.
Yeah. I suppose Wildbow will tell us what to think by the end of the story, I'm sure.
Yeah, let's not spend too much time discussing it because, I'm just going to believe whatever Wildbow tells me to believe.
He will give us the answer to politics by the end of the story.
I fully expect it.
No pressure. Is there anything else anybody wants to talk about?
Not for me.
Yeah, no, I think we've covered a lot of ground here today.
I'm feeling I'm really glad we brought you on STF because I feel a bit more grounded in my opinions on the conspiracy thanks to getting this sort of filtered version of your doc. I'm now quite convinced that blunt munchins involved, which I hate, but that's from that whole section of us going through who it could be that's donning the furs. Blunt feels like the safest bet to me.
I hope I haven't led you astray.
I mean, my ideas before were definitely worse, so you've at least led me closer, I'm sure. Well, I suppose then it's probably time for us to ask some of the questions that we always ask of our guests.
Yep.
So I'll take the first one, the relatively newer one, which is, which Kennet other would be your first choice for familiar?
So I am absolutely cheating and saying that Nina is technically a Kennet other right now because Zed and by extension her are currently in Kennet. So she is a Kennet other. I'm declaring it now. And I think a librarian animus would be just the best thing ever. She seems super cool.
Yeah, that's a very good answer. I mean,
Yep.
kind
Not
of
at all in
cheating,
the
but
spirit
we'll
of the
allow
question,
it. Yeah.
but I can't argue with the choice.
It was too hard.
Well, the other question that we ask everyone who comes on for one of these episodes is, who is the best Kenneteer? This is almost always the toughest one.
This was so hard. So I feel like I'm betraying Avery by saying this because Avery was my favorite character pretty much through the end of arc 9. Like, I was solid Avery. But over the past few arcs, I feel like the scales have just slowly tipped over to Verona, and now she's my favorite. She's just so unfazed by so much of this world. Like, for a long time, I did not picture Tashlet as being horrifying looking at all. Like, we got a description of her, but Verona's just so chill with it that you don't really notice how terrifying she is. And then someone made this excellent fan art of Tashlet. I wish I could remember who it was, but it was so good. And I looked at that picture and I was like, oh my God, she's terrifying. And I love that Verona just doesn't see it that way at all. Like, she just looks at her, meeting her for the first time in the woods at night during an invasion. And she looks at Tashlet and she's just like, wow, I love this whole thing you've got going.
Yeah, her ability not to judge a book by its cover has consistently been one of her greatest superpowers.
Well, she's so non-judgmental of the others she meets, especially. Like, she doesn't expect them to behave or communicate like humans normally do. She doesn't fall back on human norms of interaction or courtesy. Like, she just is this completely blank slate and meets them halfway. And she's ready to just befriend anyone. And it's great. And I appreciate it.
Yeah, although she does have lines, they're just very sensible, good ones. Like, when she met Tashlet, it's like, do you like eat babies?
Yeah, that's a sensible line.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of like, she respects others, but also she's not going to put up with evil shit. Like, it's a pretty, like, you can't really argue with the whole logic of that setup.
Well, I love how Tashlet responds to that question with kind of like a so-so gesture, and Verona's like, yep, that checks out. That's good enough for me.
We still never really had that elaborated on, have we? Like, why she just didn't say no.
That's going to be a terrifying twist that's going to come in right at the very end.
I mean, maybe she...
Have we had a scene of Tashlet crossing paths with a baby yet?
I'm just thinking, didn't she said some weird shit happened when she went to visit her brother that lives in a knotted place.
Oh yeah.
So maybe she accidentally ate some baby or
maybe she
peer pressured into eating baby. I don't know.
She likes like fried eggs, and that's like her. She can't quite say it because that's like chicken, unfertilized embryo.
Guys, we've never seen Tashlin and a baby in the same room because she eats them before we get to see them.
I think you're going to say because she is a baby.
Cannibalism.
Whoa, what a twist.
Ruben, where are you landing on who's the best Kenneteer at the moment?
I still am a hardcore Lucy stan, although I feel like we haven't got a Lucy chapter in a while, so I don't know.
I feel I'm almost doing a little bit the opposite to you, STF, in that I was such a diehard Verona fan for most of the story, but over the last 3 or 4 arcs, like Avery's just been creeping in there. I very much relate to like a lot of her like FOMO and stuff that's been going on, and I guess as she started to like conquer that, it's getting more and more inspirational, and it's just like I think I'm still putting Verona in the number 1 slot, but like the needle is sort of tilting closer to Avery all the time. Yeah.
Wildbow has done it again. He's managed to make us all perfectly balanced between the 3 Kenneteers.
Yeah, which is like continues to be impressive how much I don't feel like it's like I almost start every live read with like, oh yay, it's a so and so chapter. There's never that moment like when you open up a new chapter in Lord of the Rings and it's Frodo and Sam and you're like, oh fuck. It's just gonna be walking through Mordor whinging about shit for 20 pages. There's never been that in Pale.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. I guess we should do the other thing that we always do before we wrap up, which is discuss the arc title, take a bit of an opportunity to inspect that. Elliot, do you have a definition of false moves for us?
I do. According to a website on the internet that I forget where I pulled this from, a false move is an unwise or careless action that could have dangerous consequences. And there's a bunch of stuff that can apply to. I mean, obviously, one of the first things that jumped to my mind was we started this arc with the Kenneteers calling that trial on Phinia.
Yeah.
That didn't work out so hot for a bit there.
God, that chapter was hard to read.
Oh, yeah, we didn't call that out back when we were doing the arc summary. 12.1 and 12.z, both bookends of this arc were just, they were angering chapters. Like, reading Reed's backstory, you just wanted to hit something. Reading Phinia's trial, you just wanted to hit something. Like, it's this chapter started and ended. So this arc started and ended on very frustrating entries.
The other meaning that like an unwise action that could have dangerous consequences could connect to is like all of the questionable moves that the girls and the Kennet others have made before this arc that are now all coming back to bite them in arc 12, like killing Alexander, killing the witch hunter. It's all kind of descending on them at once.
Yeah, I love that.
I also found another definition of this, which it's very similar. I just liked the wording that defined this as in an already dangerous or risky situation, something which makes your position even more dangerous, which feels very spot on to just this entire arc. It just feels like things keep getting piled on and the situation keeps getting worse.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And like you can sort of see like going back to Charles and his false move trying to set up the red heron envigelment, like so many people's actions have sort of been catching up with them, or at least we've been hearing about it in this arc.
I feel like I should call myself out and say that I did not at all know the definition of false moves, and for most of the arc, I spent interpreting it as like the literal interpretation of false move, which is a move that is false, as in like someone pretending to do one thing but actually doing another, and that's
like
just
a feint.
What I thought.
Yeah.
Which of course also connects back to the Phinia trial, but it also just made me incredibly paranoid about everything that anyone did the entire arc.
I mean, this is Wildbow. I don't think we should limit our interpretations to the dictionary definition. I think that's absolutely valid. The tie into the Phinia trial feels spot on. It obviously this was the arc with the Charles interlude. Sorry, not Charles interlude. The Charles interrogation. Where the time we finally got some just straight up lies. Of course, it was in false moves.
Oh yeah, like Cleo lying. That was a type of false move.
Oh yeah, God, I'm still angry at how well that got me. I
Oh,
knew she could lie, but I just
Uh,
assumed she wasn't.
this universe has made me so trusting of people's word. I was like, a new friend. Let's befriend the witch hunters. And it did not. It was an Avery chapter 2, which always makes me
yep.
think that we're about to make
Yeah.
some friends.
That's why it
Feel
was
lied
so
to.
good, because of course it would work perfectly on Avery.
Oh, and friendly reminder, speaking of false moves, did we ever find out what Marissa did that tripped Jasmine's bedroom alarm before we saw her in like the living room? Is that still an open question?
Shit, I forgot about that. Uh,
Ah,
that's probably nothing. You know the
probably
fairy.
nothing. The fairy are always very straightforward. I'm sure we don't have to think about this.
You know, they just
Mm.
waste time. They're not setting up Rube Goldberg machines everywhere. It's fine. Okay, yeah, that's worrying.
Well, all right. And on that note, I suppose.
Um, I suppose the thing we normally do after this section is, force our bold and specific predictions on who done it out of the guest. I suppose we've
Yeah,
already covered that a little bit.
yeah.
But you still, SDF, you still feel like the guest we need to ask this of the person who's done the research. Um, what is your bold and specific prediction on who done it?
Okay, see, the whole point of the conspiracy doc is that I can hedge all of my bets. Like just just lay out ideas for everyone without actually taking a stance. But at this point, what this question I think comes down to is how much was Charles hiding when he confessed? Like, because if he was being pretty clear and he wasn't lying about the things that we didn't already call him out for lying for, then the story and the timeline become somewhat clear. Like, Charles has the idea for the Red Heron. It goes terribly wrong because he's forsworn. He then has the idea to kill the Carmine, and then he and the girl by candlelight, later Edith, work on that together. Where girl by candlelight's motive is initially to help him out because she owes him a bit, and then later she realizes that she has a lot to gain from the plot. And then Marissa hops on board later to harness the plot to help herself. And she gives it a bit more strategy and direction, possibly brings on board a champion to don the furs, or maybe that was Charles' role all along from the beginning. There's kind of room for wiggle room here. And in this timeline, in this simple timeline, Charles is effectively our mastermind, if mastermind is really the right word for what happened. There are definitely problems with this theory. There's some things where the timeline is a little bit wonky, and some room for things to have happened a little differently, but that's kind of option one. That's the simple option. And then there's option two, where Charles is actually leaving out a significant part of the story, potentially that there's actually this another shadowy figure in the background that's been guiding things from the beginning. Maybe one of the judges, although, or maybe Miss even. Maybe Charles had help designing the initial ritual. Maybe the choir had two purposes from the beginning, like carrying out Charles' revenge and accomplishing the goal of this shadowy figure. Like that could neatly resolve some details, except that I don't really know who that would be. Like I said earlier that I just don't think that it would be Miss. And if it were her, I feel like I would probably end up agreeing with whatever her plan was. So, because of that reason, I do lean towards the first theory that I laid out, because I feel like it's just what I have the most evidence for, and I feel like I have to stick with that.
Fair enough.
Makes sense.
I also think it would be fitting if the conspiracy was not simple, but straightforward once you picked up the pieces. Like, if the point of Pale at the end of the day isn't the crazy twists of the murder mystery, like if the point is the themes the story is exploring and the questions it's trying to answer and the aftermath of taking down the conspiracy, then I think the first theory does make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I'd almost call that the other verse special at this point is the grand complicated master plan is actually, when you think about it, pretty straightforward, and like it's frustrating that you didn't confidently guess it beforehand. I'm thinking of like the moment when Marissa faked us all out and wasn't actually her. And I think a lot of us who were live reading it were fucking trolling through her every word she was saying, trying to figure out how it possibly worked. And
that chapter took me so long to read.
Yeah, and I thought she was pulling all this crazy wording shit, and I was trying to piece it together. It's like,
No,
it was way simpler than that. It just wasn't her.
It's the simplest trick, the one that Faye have consistently done over and over again, which is just pretend to be somebody else.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I feel like all these mysteries, it's not going to be super convoluted or anything. It's like once we hear it, we're just going to be like, well, yeah, that makes sense.
Although
Um,
it's funny, we think of it as being straightforward now, but God, it was a long way to get here. I just
yeah.
got my friend to start reading Pale, and she's like halfway through arc 1, and we were talking about the conspiracy. And at one point, I was like, "Oh well, it's one of those stories where it's more or less who you think it is at the end of the day." And she's like, "Oh, so Matthew and the Faceless Woman?" And I was like, "Oh right, it's not at all straightforward."
No, you're right. That's part of the magic of this world is that it feels straightforward once you have the answer. Like you look at all the pieces once you have them, and it's like, well, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But Walbo has this way of writing it where that's really hard to put together before he wants you to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, God, I put together the conspiracy doc because I was like, well, surely the truth is in there, and all you need to do is just lay it all out and look at it and have a bird's eye view, and it'll come together. And I wrote 148 pages, and I still don't know who did it. So,
Yeah, exactly. And then we'll get the reveal, and it'll be like, oh, yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Cool. Well, okay, we'll lock that in as
Yep.
your official guest then.
Yeah, I guess that brings us to the end of our episode. Now, hold on. We're going to do a back-to-pack section, aren't we? Okay, cool.
Yes. And just to set up this back to pact, I believe STF you're only just at the start of arc 4 of Pact.
yes, I am keeping myself exactly paced with Pale in comparison. I'm actually a chapter behind, but up until then, I was completely at pace with Pale in comparison.
That's very fun. Okay, cool. So I guess as long as you are up to date with Pale in comparison, you should be safe to come to this back to pact. But
Yep.
if you're behind there, then it's probably not safe.
Yep. But before we get there, for those of you who might be dropping off because you aren't caught up with Pale in comparison, just
Which if you are doing that, if you are dropping off like that, go do that then. Go start listening to Pale in comparison.
yes. Oh, sorry. I thought you were saying go drop off. We don't want you. Get out of here.
Oh no. Well, we don't because we want you to go to Malia and Jenny and start reading Pact.
Yes.
Yes,
but,
listen to Pale in comparison.
It is wonderful, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, just before we do go back to Pact, again, thank you for joining us, STF, Snowdrop's tiny fan.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. This was so fun.
No, of course.
It's great having you.
Yeah, definitely great to have you, especially as we get into all the conspiracy theories coming to a head. Why not bring on the expert? Is there? I guess we'll link to the Guide to the Carmine Conspiracy doc in our show notes. Is there anything else that you'd like to mention for our audience to check out?
Nope, I'm really boring, but go read the doc. I'm really proud of it.
You absolutely should be.
Yes, 100%.
It's phenomenal.
It's wonderful. Okay, well, yeah, you can check out the link to the Guide to the Carmine Conspiracy doc in our show notes, as well as links to all the other stuff like our Twitter. You can find our website where you can find Pale in Comparison, the Drift Media website, and all that good stuff.
Yep, don't forget about our Patreon, patreon.com/doofmedia. It is Ruben and I's share of that Patreon money that is directly funding the live stream that we are currently preparing.
Yes.
All packed up too.
25-hour live stream.
We have some very fun stuff planned, and we wouldn't be able to do that without the supporters from that Patreon. So thank you to everyone who is contributing.
Yeah. In a very real and tangible way, all of the money that people support into that Patreon just gets fed back into us improving our setups and show, but also just doing things that we think the community will enjoy. I mean, that's what we spend all of that money on. So
don't forget about Wildbow's Patreon too, patreon.com/Wildbow. He made this conspiracy we're trying to unravel. That's impressive. So give him some money if you can.
All right. Now that the non-pact reading nerds are out of the room, let's get into some back-to-pact stuff, shall we?
Let's do it.
So, where should we start?
Pact has been so interesting so far. Admittedly, I was not going to read Pact, but then Pale in Comparison started, and it just sounded like such an interesting idea that I have been following along with that podcast, which has been absolutely worth it. It's delightful, and Pact is, of course, just it's been interesting to read Pact and like compare all of the themes that and like the different perspective on the other verse that we get from Pact as compared to Pale. Like one of the things that's been really difficult to adjust to, which I'm sure all of the Pact readers expected as the Pale readers started reading the book, is just the way that others are looked at and interacted with by Blake, especially. Like they're very much the antagonist of his story so far. Like, have we met an other up through 4.3 that has really been a friend to him? I mean, besides June, who's sort of a tool, so does she count? The exposure we get to others is like the others who pretend to torture a pizza guy to death in his front yard for no reason, the ones who try to kill him for no reason. That like it just feels like we're absolutely seeing the first taste of others that we get from Pact is this sort of the one-dimensional dark side first. Whereas I feel like in Pale, we start from the opposite ends of the spectrum and we start with, hey, others are they're just people. They're living in this town. They're living out their lives. And then as Pale goes on, you start to get like little tastes of their darker sides. Like we see John's backstory and how many people he's killed. We see Alpina like not feeling bad at all about like torturing children in their nightmares. Like, but it's very late in the story at that point, and it's hard to recontextualize them as anything but just like people.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting. I mean, both stories do explore, some of these ideas of like humanity and class structures and oppression. I think in Pact, you really feel it in the relations to practitioners a lot more explicitly than in Pale, which is relations to others. But yeah, I think it's great that. I mean, to be very clear about it, it's the Otherverse is a system, is a world where these kind of inherent systems take such front stage in their manifestations, right? So of course it's a great way to examine the kind of systems and class interactions and kind of societal groupings that we have, because they are given tangible form in the Otherverse in a much stronger way.
Yeah, I keep waiting for as Pact goes on, I keep waiting for us to meet an other that like is going to feel more like a person to Blake and is going to let us see more of the human side of others. But then even as I think that, I'm wondering if that's just because I'm coming from Pale and so I'm very other focused and I'm just waiting for the plot to start revolving around others, and it's probably not going to, but I'm ready for it to.
This is very hard to comment on without
So yeah, can
spoiling
we just
anything.
clarify? So where exactly, for our audience who might not be caught up to Pale in comparison, where exactly are we up to here? We're up to...
Oh, yeah. So Blake has just been kind of kicked out of Jacob's spell. He's kicked out of his grandmother's domain, and he's gone back to Toronto. And all we've really seen so far in Toronto is that he kind of briefly went back to his apartment, and now he's met Conquest, who seems like a real piece of work.
Yeah, I was so excited to see Pale people hit Conquest, just because the concept of lords has been talked about so much in Pale, but we haven't actually seen what a lord looks like. And you meet Conquest, and you got to think this is the worst case scenario for a guy who has like complete control over a city like Toronto.
Yeah.
Like sort of selling the importance of the judges. You can't do much better than Conquest for like being like, oh, this is why we need people outside of the cities.
Yeah, well, because lordship has been talked about in Pale as sort of this passing idea of like, oh yeah, lords exist. Maybe that could be a solution. But that's been kind of the extent that we've seen it. And like meeting Conquest definitely exposes a lot of the flaws in the lordship system. Like, at least the judges, they have leeway in how they enforce things, but they're supposed to be ultimately pretty impartial. Like even the Arum, at least let both the girls and Phinia cheat at the trial. Like at least he was equal. And there's 4 of them, so it feels a little bit more democratic. And, at the end of the day, they're roles. They're just extensions of the system. And like, there's problems with the system, of course, but there isn't this personal nature to it where you're sucking up to and deferring to just like this random person with an obscene amount of power over what happens in this territory.
Yeah, he's a pretty simple example of how corruptible the idea of having one leader who's the person who's the most powerful is as a system.
And he can just make
I
these jaw-droppingly stupid decisions, like unleashing a demon just onto the city. That's his plan. Like, oh my god. I mean, we haven't seen demons so far in Pact, but from the way that people are acting towards it, obviously this is a stupid idea, but no one can oppose him in a meaningful way because he's the Lord, and that's bullshit.
Yep.
It makes me even more leery of the culprit's plan, since it does seem like it'll end with a lot more lords than there were before, which is now seeming like a really bad idea.
Yeah, and because I just have to imagine, like, if you looked at somewhere like the Blue Heron Institute and thought, "Oh, who would become the lord of this area?" I mean, well, the previous candidates were Alexander and Bristow, but now Moss has got to be a top candidate, and it's like these are the people you're giving more power to if you let lords get more power. Um,
Yeah, great idea. Let's disrupt the system by making it worse.
Yeah. I mean, I have to assume the culprit's goal is that in amongst all that infighting and stuff, the practitioners get weak enough that some places won't get taken over by lords or something. Maybe that's where Kennett as the safe haven comes in, but yeah,
Or
yeah,
possibly another can become the Lord.
true,
But
yeah.
there aren't any candidates that feel like they're on a high enough level to be able to pull that off.
Yeah.
Nice other lords like Conquest, you
Yeah,
know?
exactly.
It doesn't have to be a corrupt
Perfect, a
human. We can have
perfect
corrupt
system.
others.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like you said before about like you wish that you could have a benevolent dictator, which is, I mean, the Lord is a dictator. And if you could get the right person in a Lord seat, on some level, you could argue that that's much better than the judges who are somewhat drones of the system, because the lords can push back against that and they can act against the system if they choose to. But all of that hinges on getting a benevolent dictator. And I mean, like I said, from what we've seen of just practitioner society, do those people exist? Because if they do, they're pretty few and far in between.
Well, and there's that discrepancy between the people who want power and the people who should have it.
Mm.
Like we saw Louisa Crow, she'd be my pick for a practitioner who could be trusted with power.
Yeah.
And she's fallen into the
Yes,
background.
she has seemingly retired, right?
Yeah, because she's the sort of person who deserves that power. She's the sort of person who's out of the picture. Um, there's a bit of a correlation there. We see it a little bit with Ray and Durachet as well. Um, yeah. To jump back a bit, this is one of the things I was most excited for, seeing pale people jump into Pact. What you mentioned about the way others are seen/treated a little bit differently. It's less overtly sympathetic towards them, especially at the start. Like you have in the notes here, goblins are scary? Question mark. I loved seeing Malia wrestle with that in Pale in comparison. I think Pale's made us so sympathetic to goblins overall. They've been painted as kind of mischievous children in Pale, whereas
No,
really our first introduction to them in Pact is they killed Maggie's whole town and like set it on fire. Like holy shit. Um, it's such it really broadens the world with how different that perspective is, and I love to hear more about just how you've been reconciling some of this stuff.
God, when we're introduced to goblins in Pale, the first thing we see is one of them like make a poop joke, and the girls are horrified by this, but it's so innocuous. And
Mm.
I don't know if you've been listening to Our Mom Critiques Wildbow. If you're not, you
Yeah,
should be, because it's just excellent. But Malia and Jenny's mom has talked about goblins as like, oh, they're so harmless and they're so funny and they're just too stupid to hurt anyone. And that's absolutely the vibe you get from Goblins in Pale, except you get these little windows into what they might actually be doing. There's the conversation Verona has with the goblins in 2.7, where they talk a little bit about what they get up to outside of Kennet. And they describe this really horrifying scene where like this baby is like given a bunch of piercings and like tied to different parts of the room. And then they follow that up by saying that that's sanitized. Oh my God. But you sort of write off that sort of thing because you're not seeing it directly. What you're seeing from the goblins is them quite literally being PG-13. And so even if on an intellectual level, you sort of realize that goblins are meaner than what we've seen of them so far, it's different than seeing it. And then in Pact, you just immediately get hit with, oh, these goblins killed off an entire town, or that goblin that Grandma Rose's friends summoned left that one girl literally catatonic,
Yeah.
which is...
yeah.
I, I think the Fae are a great lens for that as well, because we've like, I think Keller, is that the name of the really psychotic one in
Ev. I think it's Ev and Keller. I
Yeah.
think Ev might be the more sadistic one.
One of them really seems to love the concept of flaying skin. I can't remember which one it is. But yeah, and it's just kind of like, Marissa and Guillemette are kind of scary, but they're also, especially in the first half of Pale, you're like, their interplay is really fun, Whereas, some of the Fae in Jacob's Bell, do you get the sense that they're like this thin veneer of society on top of just serial killers, like legit straight up serial killers?
Yeah, because it's like 1.3 or 4, which is where Blake first meets the Fae.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that's the one where Ev or Keller is like, and I'll flay your skin and you'll like, orgasmically whine every time the wind blows or something. It's just like, okay, we need to get
like,
the fuck
what
away
the fuck
from these
is this?
people.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and it's funny because the fairy in Pale, I feel like, had the same treatment as the goblins, where we're just told over and over again, oh, Fae are scary, but then you actually meet them and they're like very tame. And so even if you might intellectually know that you should be scared of Fae, you're not actually.
Yeah.
So it's been hard.
Glimpses of things in Pale that have come through, like the milkmaid. I just love, like, Pact has obviously been darker and has things that are more in line with that. And so glimpses of things like the milkmaid from Pale, who are just fucking horrifying. I love I'm really enjoying seeing and hearing people find more of these things in Pact.
Oh no, I hope there's not going to be things like the milkmaid. I barely got through that scene. I keep hearing that Pact is scary, and I'm like wondering if I'm going to make it all the way through.
I think if you can get through that milkmaid scene and like 1.Z in Pale as well.
Yeah, true.
If you can make it through those, I don't think there's anything in Pact that's like, at least for me, that was much worse or more harrowing.
Yeah, I don't think so either. Those are probably some of the most hard to read things across, both stories.
Well, that's a relief. At least there's not going to be anything worse than that scene. With no comment about the frequency of scenes that meet that same level.
No comment.
No comment. Yeah, for sure.
Neutral response, huh?
Yeah. Oh god. I mean, just like, and this is why Pale in Comparison is such a fun podcast, because there's just some real fun stuff in store.
It's hard.
Yeah, it's so great seeing people go the other way. Like I've enjoyed like tackling Pale coming from the perspective of someone who's read Pact, but I'm amazed at how enjoyable it is to watch people go the other way too.
I mean, this was part of the fun of when we did Deep Impact as well earlier, is there were so many things in there that I was so excited for you to come across. And it just is, it's consistently true that there are a number of things, and I'm just talking like scary stuff, but like really powerful, positive moments as well. Just like all kinds of things that are just like, I'm so excited for them to meet this character, or I'm so excited for them to have this scenario, like it's delightful. It's so much fun to listen to and to discuss.
I'm definitely coming into it just totally programmed to think the absolute best of any others that we meet. Like when I first heard about, is it Johans?
Yeah, Johannes.
Johannes, I think is the pronunciation we decided on.
Okay, so when we first heard about Johannes's domain, and it was described as like, oh, it's a theme park for others, my first thought was like, okay, well, that's just practitioner propaganda for, a place that's sealed off and where others can just live out their lives. And my immediate association was like, oh, that's going to be like Kennet. It's going to be like a place where others can just be themselves, and that's great. And then we sort of, now granted, we've only seen it in the book from a distance exactly once, but now it seems like it's something much more sinister than that, and it seems like it might be closer to like the culprit's plan for Kennet, which we talked about earlier, something that's not just others living out their lives, but something a little bit more twisted, where like innocence is weak and the others are more hunting than like living and coexisting, I guess.
Without like confirming or denying any of those thoughts, I will definitely say that like I think in one of our first back to pacts that we would have done for Power Reflections, there was a big conversation about, as soon as we got introduced to the idea of Kennet, it was like, oh, it's interesting to compare and contrast this to what Johannes was doing.
Yeah, yeah.
So I definitely, I think you're spot on that. Like, it almost immediately draws to mind the various plans for Kennet.
I do wonder about just any thematic parallels that might arise between Pale and Pact. Like, it's not a sequel to Pact plot wise, but I feel like I'm seeing a lot of the same ideas coming up. Like, Pact might be starting to ask questions that I'm seeing being answered in Pale. Like, I feel like there's a lot of focus in Pale and somewhat in Pact so far of just like, what does it look like to practice ethically? And like, is that even possible? Like, even Blake, who is just scrambling for any scrap of power that he can get, the first thing he does is bind an other and like steal a lock of hair from another other. So he's taking his power and he's imprisoning people to get it, but he's in this very tough spot.
Sorry, to be fair, she started it.
Yeah, she did begin that duel. In bed.
She was not a victim in this situation.
Didn't Mrs. Lewis was saying to Blake, "Oh, you should have done a lot worse than that to her." So Blake was, I think, pretty restrained in that circumstance.
No, he's quite moral. I think Blake is quite moral from what we've seen of him. And even with that baseline morality, you see that he's being put in these impossible situations, and I feel like it raises this question of like, God, like if you're a good person, what do you do in this universe? And I don't know where Pact is necessarily taking that question, but I do know that Pale is answering it. With the Kenneteers finding this commune of others and finding this ethically sourced power and being, 100 times as powerful as Blake currently is in the story.
I think it's especially interesting to consider parallels between Blake and somebody like Raquel Musser, right? Like, it's not a perfect comparison, but Raquel Musser is somebody who is in a family situation where she is, just by virtue of who her parents are and who she's related to, at the bottom rung of a ladder that she's kind of desperately trying to escape. And I think it's very interesting coming from Pact, where that's Blake's whole thing. It's a very interesting, different perspective to take when thinking about somebody like Raquel.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really interesting connection.
Yeah, I really want to.
Yeah, I know. No spoilers.
I really want to work off what you were saying about those thematic ties between the two, but I definitely should not if we said this is a section someone like Malia can listen to. But I love that train of thought.
Yeah, I think it's worth putting the thought on it that like Pact and Pale definitely are crossing over thematically, and I think the thing that's really interesting to compare them and that's different about them is in Pale the trio are clearly such outsiders, where even Pact, where Blake is an outsider, he's an outsider, but he's kind of learning from somebody like Mrs. Lewis or the journals and notes of Granny Rose, who aren't outsiders, and so his perspective is, like you said, he bound June very quickly, and that there was a bit of like, oh, this feels kind of a little dodgy when that was happening, but definitely hasn't been focused on since, or to the same extent that things like the Kenneteers binding of potential binding of Edith, or of I can't remember the name, but the one who was the trio that came in with Reggie, the composite kid. Like the conversations around binding there were so in depth and so like morally challenging and interesting, whereas Blake has been able to slip into the practitioner mindset more actively, just because even though he is an outsider, he's not as much of an outsider as the Kenneteers.
Yeah, even that exposure that the Kenneteers are getting to this other part of the other verse, I guess it's a bit of an advantage morally, because you have people showing you a different way and helping you ask these moral questions and answer them in satisfactory ways.
Yeah. I mean, I think the two texts work very well together because they're tackling similar themes from different perspectives in a very different perspectives that are both like completely justifiable. Like Blake is very much from day one has been in a fight for his life.
Yeah. Poor Blake.
Yeah, I think you're right. The way the two complement each other it's so good, and that's why I'm enjoying seeing people read them in both orders.
100%.
like it's so funny. You're thinking about the stuff like what went down with June. Like, when I was coming in Pact first, I read about him, binding June, or the way Maggie, just sort of treats all goblins as the enemy and stuff. And so I was new to the world. I just sort of went with it. I was like, "Yep, this makes sense. This is how things should sort of be done." And it's sort of funny seeing like how that evolved as I kept reading versus people coming from Pale kind of going the other way and going, "What are you doing?"
Yeah, and having to unlearn some of what I've learned from Pale of just like all others are good and they're all trying their best. And then in Pact, I feel like we see a lot of the other side of that of like, nope, there are some that just really suck. And kind of tying into the themes of Pale, how do you come up with a system that works these less nice others into it and accounts for them, which I feel like is not something we see as often in Pale.
Well, yeah, and especially because like the justification for the Seal of Solomon in Pale a lot of the time is like things used to be really bad and we had to stop these others, and like Pale like doesn't really show us those bad others because that's not the point it's trying to make. Whereas Pack definitely from the start is sort of like showing you those ones that were the problem.
Yeah.
Anyway,
All
oh
right,
man,
yeah.
I'm so excited to see yourself, Malia, and everyone else continue to work through Pact. I think it's so fun seeing people come into this text that's in the same world, but I think catches you off guard with how different it is. And Pale caught us off guard when we
Yeah,
started with
100%.
how different its take on the world was, and I think that's so fun.
Well, definitely looking forward to keep reading that.
All right. Well, that's the
Oh,
end
sorry,
of our. Oh
I'm
no.
just gonna get a quick plug in, just for the audiobook for Pact, just in case people
Oh
do
yes.
the audiobook. That's started up again. And in fact, the entire thing has been recorded, so it's releasing daily. So in about a month and a half, it's just going to be finished. Uh so if you get started now, I doubt you'll catch up. There's essentially the whole Pact audiobook out there if you want to listen to it.
Oh, seconded. I've actually been reading Pact solely through listening to the audiobook, so I've only been listening to it. And it's really, really high quality. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, Speed Chuck does an amazing job.
Yeah. All right. Well, again, Snowdrop's Tiny Fan. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
And yeah, that's that.
We
already did the outro, so
never have an outro for these parts.
Yep.
N.